Welcome to the next episode of Science in the Break. In this episode, we are going to chat about something that is more advantageous than echo intensity that we talked about in the previous episode. Really, we'll be chatting with Mike about texture analysis and how can we do texture analysis on ultrasound images.
With Mike, we will discuss about the usage of texture analysis in research and clinical settings. We will understand if we can mitigate the issue that we discussed in the previous video related with echo intensity. And then we want to finally understand if there is a relation between texture analysis and the muscle composition, if there are any study or not, and exploring eventually clinical perspective. Enjoy the video.
So texture analysis is a very broad term that is used to describe basically different computer processing algorithms to characterize the texture of an image, which we kind of have an intuitive sense, but a mathematical description of it is a little more challenging. And so echo intensity would actually fall under the category of texture analysis. It's just one component of a very large component. And so there's different, the ultrasound literature is mainly focused on echo intensity for good reason. It's simple to implement, it's easy to understand, it seems to correlate with different functional measures within people and physiological measures such as fat infiltration or fibrotic infiltration. But as we've discussed, there's a lot of issues with echo intensity, like patient characteristics, like the adipose tissue. And so perhaps these additional texture features can overcome some of these issues. If you imagine just a square and you were to divide that square in half, and the top half is a black rectangle and the lower half is a white rectangle, and then take that same square, but then rather than dividing it in half with a rectangle, almost think of like a checkerboard pattern. So both of those images would have the same number of black and white pixels. And so echo intensity would be completely equivalent between those two images. But there's like a spatial relationship there. And so texture analysis can now begin to quantify that spatial relationship. Rather than just looking at the individual pixel intensities, you kind of look at the relationships between the pixels.
Do you think this kind of texture analysis or a more advanced indicator can be much more useful than echo intensity because they are machine independent and settings independent? So then we can merge data from different center, or if I have my data set, you have your data set, we can make an absolute comparison. It will be easier, or do you think that one is one of the main advantage or not? Because I think it is.
Yeah, I don't have any data and I can't point to any data to demonstrate that, but I think it does have those advantages. The few things I can mention that have been done is we know one of the differences between different ultrasound units is the gain setting, like how bright that image is.
Yeah.
And so if you were to increase the gain and look at the same muscle, increasing the gain, you'll see basically a linear correlation with echo intensity. It's increasing. Versus if you look at these sort of texture features, as you increase the gain, there are influence, but to such a less extent. Like there might be a 200% increase in your echo intensity with increasing gain, which may only result in a 10% increase in these texture features. And so the image features, the ultrasound equipment settings might influence these features a lot less than these echo intensity type features. So it has that potential to mitigate some of those issues, but at the same time, no one's really examined how these texture features compare to these physiological measures. And so you might get this nice measure that's independent of the ultrasound equipment settings, but if it doesn't relate to anything important physiologically, I mean, it's kind of a mute point at that sense.
Yeah, but at least it would allow for meta-analyses and things like that to be done and try and find an answer to that physiological question.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's an area ripe for exploration. And the nice thing is like all of these older publications that have done echo intensity compared to whatever your outcome, you know, glucose handling, fat infiltration. I mean, it's just a secondary analysis you can not easily perform. It's one of the challenges is actually implementing these features, but it's a possibility.
Now, Mike, I read that paper, and it was last night, so it was a little bit quick. So I definitely plan on reading it again. I got a long car ride today, but were there much in the way of like repeated testing and reliability with the texture analysis? So I'm just wondering if like echo intensity, if the probe is slightly tilted, you might get a little bit of a different reading, or if you're a centimeter off, but more or less, I don't think echo intensity will change much if I'm half a centimeter to the right or left. Whereas I could imagine texture analysis perhaps being a little bit perhaps more sensitive to change if you have like one particular tiny section in a muscle that you're getting where there's just a little bit more fibrotic tissue.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges is placement of where you're actually, like the placement of your box in which you're analyzing echo intensity or texture features, and that definitely has an impact on it. Echo intensity, you can kind of outline the entire muscle, and so you're going to get a more reliable measure. With these texture features, you tend to want a square box, and so you can't really do these like nice cross-sectional areas, so you're going to capture less of the muscle, which will automatically give you less reliability in terms of placement of that box, in terms of you place it in the upper right corner versus lower left quadrant. That might change it. The one nice feature about texture analysis in relation to echo intensity is that you're no longer worried about the absolute pixel values. And so if you kind of tilt the probe a little bit, you might decrease your pixel values because you're no longer on a perpendicular plane. But because it's all about the relationships amongst pixels, as long as those are decreasing or changing to the same degree, that relationship won't change as much as the absolute pixel comparisons. So it might have increased reliability in that sense.
I have a question for you by thinking about the clinical perspective, because I use quite extensively echo intensity in a clinical point of view, but yeah, I'm not against echo intensity. Before we were speaking about a lot of limitation, but at the same time, I know that clinical people really like echo intensity because it's simple to understand, simple to analyze, to compute. So my question is, do you think is it possible to have a smooth transition toward texture analysis in clinics, or it's something that is not that easy because then like not technical people will have hard time in understanding and applying?
I've dealt with these measures, I've computed these measures, and even I struggle with interpreting them because it's not straightforward whatsoever.
Okay.
It's very challenging to deal with the amount of data you receive. In terms of this clinical application, I think the first approach really needs to be like the validity of these things before we transition to clinical aspects. But even once we do that, different software approaches. Echo intensity is easy. If you measure echo intensity using one software versus the other, you're likely going to get the same result. It's not in the case with these additional higher order features, these additional texture features. And so this has been CT actually is kind of probably the first one that started implementing these texture features. And they actually have this really nice repository where they have standard images that everyone can use to calibrate their software against. And so that if you're outside of this range, you need to relook at your software. And this was a huge international collaborative approach. So really, if we want to get into applying this clinically, we need to sort of somehow standardize the scanners that are actually acquiring the images, and then subsequently have a way to standardize software, either give everyone the same software and make it open source, or if people are implementing their own approaches, we need some sort of images that we can calibrate everyone's software on.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, so if you were to do something like spatial mapping of a muscle, right? Because you have these large muscles, for me, I'm very interested in large muscles. So taking like echo intensity from one portion of the muscle doesn't really describe the muscle, right? So I need to take like multiple measures within a muscle. And so let's say I were to do like the spatial kind of sampling where I started, from the top of the muscle and I took, measurements and I went down to take measurements and then I had this like map, right, of that muscle. Would I be able to use texture analysis? Would that be reliable to use the texture analysis on that? Or would echo intensity for each one of those measures work better?
When you apply these texture features, like one of the ones you will end up calculating will be echo intensity, basically. Mm-hmm. It's like one of the simplest texture features. And so as long as you are measuring your echo intensity, just using a nice square box, which a lot of people do rather than outlining the entire cross-sectional area, you would be able to characterize both of these features at the exact same time. So you could examine both of them. Echo intensity ends up being one single measurement. Depending on how you analyze texture features, though, you could be left with 300 different variables. And so which of those do you choose? It really comes down to like multiple hypothesis testing, which is obviously a huge challenge. And so you need to get into some sort of dimensionality reduction analysis, like principal component analysis, or even just simple averaging.
I was wondering for Mike, if I don't remember if in that study, or maybe you did, if you already tried to make an association between some texture parameter and again to go to the fat infiltration, for example, because at least for what I'm studying, is really interesting to discriminate the portion of fat infiltration, and the gold standard or what I can do is more with MRI Dixon technique, but that one is definitely a great technique, but if you can do it the same with the ultrasound, it will be easier, day-to-day applicable, and less expensive. So that one is also my dream, to do some kind of, to extract this parameter with the ultrasonography.
Yeah, I think no one's done it. And that would be a great study to compare like echo to MRI based measures of fatty infiltration, and then look at like how texture feature. Does it give you a better association? Does it give you a poorer association? I think that validation study is really the next step that needs to be done that no one's really examined. So yeah, that would be a fantastic next step.
Okay, check it out in the video description, the paper from Mike, and now a brief summary from Thea.
Is that the texture analysis gives us more of a spatial aspect, while the echo intensity does not. So there are advantages there. Yes, texture analysis seems to be more involved and more complicated mathematically. So that might be a limitation in terms of, translating it to the clinic. And, it would also require, people like with expertise to do these analysis. So it can't just be done, by people that don't have the, engineering background, that don't understand this image processing as well. Or, to tackle that limitation would be to actually have workshops that will teach people how to do these analysis, with accuracy, just like we have some workshops for other techniques. So I do think that workshops on these topics would be a lot, really informative for everyone, and make it easier for people to understand how to do these analysis. That concludes our discussion on ultrasound. Thank you so much for this great chat. So yeah, thank you so much for your time and for discussing this with me. When I record these things, I record them like 100 times, I don't know what that.